What would you do if a strange little girl looked you straight in the eyes the next morning and called you daddy? No name, no memories, nowhere to go, just wide searching eyes, and one word that could turn your whole world upside down. A man living in an old pickup truck, a little girl lost in the rain, and one unexpected moment that would rewrite the meaning of family forever. If you believe in second chances, in kindness, and in miracles that show up just when hope runs out, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if it happened to you? Now then, get ready, because the smallest things are about to change everything. That night, the rain wouldn't stop. Not the gentle, romantic kind of rain, but the kind that makes you feel like you're slowly fading away, each drop draining something deeper from your chest. Ethan Wells, once a man with a home, a daughter, and a wood shop that smelled like fresh-cut pine, now lived alone in an old pickup parked quietly at the edge of Cedar Hollow lot, a place no one noticed, a place no one asked questions. He'd grown used to the silence, to the wind brushing past the windows, to the taste of lukewarm coffee from a chipped thermos lid. But that night, something felt different. Through the misted glass, he spotted a faint movement across the street, just outside the wall of Springbrook Library. A small figure, curled up, unmoving, no umbrella, no bags, no one else in sight. Ethan hesitated. He had promised himself long ago, never again, never to risk his heart for anyone. But something inside him, maybe the sliver of a father he used to be, made him reach for the door, step out into the storm, and cross the road. The girl didn't speak her name. She didn't cry. She just clutched a worn-out teddy bear, soaked and fraying at the seams. And when Ethan wrapped his coat around her, he didn't realize he was also wrapping himself in something he could never take off. A burden, a wound, and a fragile, wordless thing called hope. The next morning, when she opened her eyes and whispered, "I'm hungry, Daddy," Ethan didn't know if he shivered from the cold or from the sound of a word he thought he'd never hear again. A word that just brought his whole world back to life. She couldn't remember her name. Every time Ethan asked, she just shook her head gently and curled tighter into the corner of the passenger seat, clutching that frayed little teddy bear like it was the only thing left in the world that still remembered who she was. Ethan sat in silence behind the wheel, watching her through the rear-view mirror. For a fleeting second, he saw his own daughter from years ago, the wide, unblinking eyes, the pressed lips, and a silence that screamed louder than words ever could. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a packet of old crackers and his battered coffee thermos. Pouring a little into the cap, he handed it to her. She took it without a word, but her hands trembled. Not from hunger, but from how long it had been since someone gave her something with kindness. When the rain finally stopped, Ethan wrapped her in an old wool blanket and sat quietly, staring at the ceiling of the truck. Tiny glow-in-the-dark stars still clung there, left over from the days his daughter used to ride in that seat. Most had peeled off over the years. Only one lonely star remained. "Let's call you Isabella," he murmured, "like the character from a book my daughter used to love." She didn't object. She just leaned her head against the window, eyes fluttering shut, like that name had brushed against some distant, half-lost memory deep inside. Ethan had no idea where she came from, but when she whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Bear," and hugged the soaked teddy close to her chest, he knew. Even though she wasn't his by blood, this little girl had just reawakened something long broken inside him, the feeling of being needed, and that alone made Ethan turn the key, fire up the engine, and, for the first time in years, he wasn't driving to escape. He was driving to find a warm breakfast for someone who wasn't a stranger anymore. Ethan had his back turned when she spoke. "Daddy?" Just one word. Soft as wind brushing past a window, but to Ethan it struck like thunder cracking open a frozen sky. He froze, slowly turned, wondering if he'd imagined it. Isabella sat curled in the seat, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep, clutching Mr. Bear like he was a piece of her heart. She raised an eyebrow and exhaled like what she'd just said was the most natural thing in the world. "We're going to get breakfast. Right, Daddy?" He didn't answer right away, just gave a small nod and started the engine. But inside, something tightened. A wave he wasn't ready for. Not fear. Something deeper. Something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Trust. They pulled up to the Rusted Spoon, a rundown diner tucked beneath a canopy of amber maple leaves. Ethan walked around to the back door, where, years ago, he used to ask for leftover coffee on the worst days of his life. Lucas Griffin, the owner and an old friend, opened the door. He paused when he saw the girl behind Ethan. "She yours?" Lucas asked, half joking, half curious. Ethan glanced at Isabella, now marveling at a swaying antique lantern, and replied quietly, "No, but this morning she called me Daddy, and I don't know who I'd be anymore if I ignored that." Lucas nodded, said nothing else. He handed Ethan a warm paper bag and a key to the room and back. "Maybe both of you could use a place to start over." Ethan didn't say thank you, but when he passed the pastry to Isabella and she broke it in half, handing him a piece like it was the most normal thing in the world, his heart knew it with painful, perfect clarity. The old life was over, and something entirely new had just begun. The egg sandwich was still warm when Ethan handed it to Isabella, the steam curling from the wrapper like a soft reminder that kindness hadn't vanished from the world just yet. Her eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe something could smell that good, and she took a bite, quietly, gratefully. They sat in a small corner of the back patio, where the morning sun cast just enough warmth to soften the worn wooden table. Isabella slowed after a few bites, then gently pushed half of the sandwich toward Ethan. "You should eat too," she said, as if they'd been family forever. Ethan took it without a word. He wasn't hungry, but his heart, it hadn't been fed in a very long time. "You don't remember your name, do you?" he asked. She nodded, eyes dropping. "Well, would it be okay if I called you Isabella?" She paused. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Isabella?" "Yeah," he smiled. "It starts with an I. Like the letters my daughter used to scribble all over scraps of wood in the shop. Maybe it's a name strong enough to hold on to the memories." Isabella thought for a moment, then gave a soft nod. "I think I like it." That one sentence, short, quiet, felt to Ethan like someone had just cracked open a door that had been slammed shut for years. She looked up, really looked at him, for the first time. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like a ghost from a broken life. He felt like someone being remembered, right here, in this moment. Maple Bloom Bakery sat quietly under a sun-drenched awning at the far end of Pinewood Street, a place that seemed ordinary to most. But for Ethan and Isabella, it was the first threshold into something no one dared to name: hope. Zoe Parker, the bakery's owner, was the kind of woman the town had never fully figured out. A widow for over a decade, she lived alone with her old oven, always had fresh coffee brewing, and rarely let anyone step close enough to touch her heart. So when Zoe saw the little girl behind Ethan, dirty, tangled hair, clutching a worn-out teddy bear, and didn't ask a single question, just quietly pushed the door open, Ethan knew. Something had just shifted. "Come in," Zoe said, her hands dusted with flour, voice calm, like welcoming strangers into her kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. "She doesn't eat much," Ethan murmured, unsure. "Then she needs something good," Zoe replied, already scooping cinnamon batter into the oven. While the pastries baked, Isabella perched on a tall stool, fingers tapping softly against the wooden counter, eyes wandering. Zoe returned and gently placed a plate of warm pastries and a small cup in front of her, painted with sunflowers. "This cup belonged to my daughter. Her name was Lila," Zoe said quietly. "Now, it's yours." Isabella didn't speak, but she wrapped both hands around the cup, lifting it like it was a treasure. A cup, a plate of pastries, and for the first time, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. Ethan stood there watching that moment unfold and realized, sometimes family begins with a warm seat and a woman strong enough to offer everything without asking a single thing. One sunny morning, sunlight soft as gold dust scattered across the rooftops, Ethan brought Isabella to the front of Laurel and Pine Bookshop. There, kids were allowed to draw with chalk on the sidewalk. Not because it looked pretty, but because it made the town feel a little less lonely. Zoe came along too, carrying a tin of ginger cookies. Lila's favorite. Isabella crouched down and picked a piece of purple chalk. No one told her what to do. No one gave suggestions, but she began to draw. First came a tall figure with messy hair and a round belly. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Then a woman with flowing hair, holding a tray of pastries. And finally, a little girl clutching a teddy bear with one eye. Above the three drawings, Isabella carefully wrote in pink chalk, "My family." Zoe stood still. Ethan bent down, eyes fixed on those words. Neither of them spoke, because deep down, both had once believed that word didn't belong to them anymore. Isabella turned, pointing at Zoe's drawing. "This is Miss Zoe. She's like a mom, but also like a fairy godmother from those old storybooks." Zoe burst into laughter, a full, honest sound that hadn't come from her chest in years. "And what about Mr. Ethan?" she asked. Isabella looked up, eyes shimmering. "He's the one who never left me behind, not even once." Ethan swallowed hard. On the sidewalk, the chalk lines began to fade in the breeze. But inside him, something came into focus for the very first time. If there's a place in the world that could be called home, maybe, just maybe, this was it. Ethan sat alone in the truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him against the tide of his own thoughts. Inside the bakery, Isabella was chattering excitedly to Zoe about a magic book she wanted to write. Through the glass, Ethan watched her smile, a rare kind of smile, unhidden, untouched by memory or fear. And then he picked up the phone. Riverbend Community Services, the place he once swore he'd never call. "Yes, I'm calling to report a missing child," he said, voice low, measured. "She doesn't remember her name, no hometown, but she's safe, and I'm looking after her." The click of keys on the other end, routine questions, a woman's voice, flat and rehearsed. But for Ethan, every question sliced at something he hadn't dared to name, the fear of losing something he never imagined he'd find. When the call ended, Ethan sat frozen, silent. He had done the right thing. He told himself that. But inside, he felt hollow, like he'd just handed back something too familiar, too precious to let go of. Zoe stepped out, catching the look in his eyes, empty, but burning with resolve. "You called, didn't you?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "So now, the miracle has to survive paperwork." Zoe placed a hand on his shoulder. "But paperwork doesn't know how a child says daddy in her dreams." Ethan turned to her, and in that quiet moment, he knew. No matter what came next, he would never let that little girl be left behind again. When the silver SUV pulled up to the curb near the bakery, Ethan felt it, something shifting in the air, like time itself had slowed for just a beat. The car door opened. A woman stepped out, her stride steady but not cold, her gaze scanning the area like she was searching for someone, or something that mattered. "Mr. Ethan Wells?" she asked as she approached. Ethan instinctively stepped in front of the truck. "Yes, and you are?" "Emily Dawson, Community Services from Riverbend." His hand tightened around the door handle. But her voice, there was no threat in it, no sharpness. "I'm not here to take Isabella away," Emily said, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity that almost startled him. "I'm here to listen." She didn't rush to ask for papers, didn't even glance inside the truck. Instead, she sat down beside him on the stoop, opened her notebook, and said, "People often think we show up just to separate families, but sometimes we get to witness something far more rare. Someone who has nothing, and yet is willing to give everything to protect a child they didn't bring into this world." The words landed like a quiet truth. Ethan said nothing. "Isabella calls you Daddy, and clearly, she believes that more deeply than anything printed on a form." Emily closed her notebook. "I'm going to recommend you for temporary guardianship evaluation. If you pass, she can stay, officially." Ethan stared at her, like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "You trust me?" "No," Emily said with a gentle smile. "I trust the look in a child's eyes when she's finally found where she belongs." That afternoon, as Ethan was hanging the new curtain Zoe had sewn for the back of the truck, a silver gray sedan rolled quietly to a stop across the street. A woman stepped out, slender frame, mud-speckled shoulders, eyes caught somewhere between two worlds. "Are you Ethan Wells?" Her voice trembled slightly but didn't break. "Yes." Ethan let the curtain fall and stepped down. She held out a photo, slightly blurred at the edges, but the face of the little girl with curly hair, a radiant smile, and a teddy bear in her arms was unmistakable. "I'm Grace Harper. I'm Isabella's mother." The world fell silent, like someone had sucked every sound out of the town in one breath. Her words came in broken waves. The accident on the way back from Fairview, the injuries, waking up in a hospital far from home, and her daughter, gone. For 6 weeks, Grace had gone from office to office, town to town, clutching that worn photo in a threadbare hope. Ethan stood frozen. He turned his head. Isabella was under the bakery awning, laughing with Zoe, her hands dusted in flour, cheeks flushed with joy. Grace followed his gaze, her voice caught in her throat. "I, I'm not here to take her away. I just want to know if she's okay." Ethan met her eyes that didn't lie. But inside, the old fear surged like wolves through snow. Could everything he'd built vanish in one moment of truth? Two strangers stood there, closer to the fragile edge between love and loss than either of them had ever been before. When Ethan walked Isabella over to the wooden bench near the bakery, Grace was already waiting, hands resting on her knees, trying to smile like that small gesture could somehow make everything less overwhelming. Isabella approached slowly, Mr. Bear tucked under her arm. She looked up at the unfamiliar woman, eyes filled with quiet confusion, but not fear. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice as soft as leaves rustling in the breeze. Grace nodded, her own voice cracking. "I used to be the one who held you every night. But if you don't remember yet, that's okay. I can wait." Ethan stood behind them, heart stretched tight between two worlds. One was the warmth of a new beginning, built from tiny, fragile acts of love. The other, a birth mother carrying memories that hadn't had time to heal. Grace didn't cry, didn't push, didn't say too much. She simply placed a pink hair clip in Isabella's hand, identical to the one she wore in the photo. "I'm not here to break anything," she said quietly to Ethan, as Isabella turned and ran back toward Zoe. If you'll allow me, I'd like to stay for a little while. Not to take her, but to help her remember she doesn't have to choose between us." Ethan followed Isabella with his eyes, her hair catching the sunset like threads tying all their lives together. He let out a long, steady breath. "You don't need my permission," he said. "I think Isabella will be the one to choose." In that moment, two broken souls, an unexpected father and a lost mother, laid down the first stone in rebuilding something neither of them thought they'd ever have again, a home. None of them called it moving in. But on a sunny morning at the start of the season, Ethan and Zoe carried a few old boxes, a wobbly wicker chair, a bag full of children's books, and a vase of dried flowers into cottage number 3, a small house on Finch Hollow Lane, just behind the bakery where everything had begun. Isabella ran barefoot across the porch, squealing with delight when she saw the cream-colored curtains Zoe had sewn fluttering in the window. Mr. Bear had his own spot, too, a worn little stool beside the miniature bookshelf Zoe had built by hand. The tiny cottage, just 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a slightly crooked wooden porch, suddenly became a place filled with laughter and the smell of cinnamon toast. Zoe didn't say much, but in the way she looked at Isabella, there was something that reached beyond every unspoken gap. Not a replacement, but a quiet kind of redemption. Ethan saw it, and every time Zoe bent down to fix Isabella's collar or carefully balanced flavors in the kitchen, he felt warm. One evening, after a simple dinner of fish cakes and salad, Isabella quietly climbed up onto the table and laid a crayon drawing in front of them. 3 people, a man with messy hair, a woman in a floral apron, and a little girl hugging Mr. Bear, scrawled across the top, in uneven but unmistakable handwriting, "My chosen family." Ethan swallowed hard. Zoe turned away, pretending to fix the napkins. Because sometime a single piece of paper drawn by a child can say what adults spend a lifetime too afraid to put into words. Some wounds are never stitched with thread and needle. They heal slowly, piece by piece, through the laughter of a child, the scent of fresh baked bread, and the quiet gaze of someone who believes you can begin again. Ethan had once lost everything: his wife, his home, his right to be a father. He lived in a truck like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But now every morning, he woke to a soft little voice whispering in his ear, "Daddy, wake up. It's morning." Isabella never tried to fix him. She simply showed up with her crumpled napkins at breakfast, with questions that caught him off guard. "If Mr. Bear marries Miss Zoe, does that mean you're going to marry someone too?" Zoe baked, and Ethan slowly remembered how to laugh. He started helping fix up the kitchen, changing light bulbs, even learning how to make strawberry jam. Once he broke a glass while clumsily doing the dishes. Isabella saw it and said, "It's okay. You're still learning, Daddy." That line didn't cut him. It planted something inside him, something alive. One evening, Ethan sat alone on the porch of cottage number 3, an old photo of his daughter in his hands. The breeze stirred, and from inside came the sound of Isabella laughing with Zoe, pillows tumbling to the floor. And in that moment, Ethan understood. He couldn't go back to rewrite the past, but he could stay and write something true now. For the first time in years, Ethan let himself believe, not just in second chances, but in something even more sacred: the chance to be loved and to be chosen as family. That afternoon, the warm kitchen of cottage number 3 was bathed in soft sunlight, golden like butter, gentle like freshly baked waffles. Ethan was clearing the plates, Zoe was straightening the corner of the tablecloth, and Grace, Isabella's birth mother, had just placed a vase of white daisies on the pinewood table. Everything felt unusually peaceful until Isabella climbed up onto a stool in the center of the room, arms crossed like she was about to address a nation. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice clear and certain. All 3 adults froze. Ethan paused mid-swipe with a jam-smeared bowl. Zoe looked up. Grace gently gripped the edge of the table. Isabella took a deep breath, pulling Mr. Bear tight to her chest. "I know I'm the luckiest kid in the whole world," she said, "because I have Mommy Grace, Daddy Ethan, and Miss Zoe. I have 2 beds, 3 hugs every morning, and 3 grown-ups who love me in 3 different ways. Who else has that many hearts in one life?" Ethan bowed his head, eyes stinging. Zoe bit her lip, and Grace couldn't hold back the tears. But Isabella wasn't done. She reached into Mr. Bear's pouch and pulled out a pink piece of paper, carefully folded, and laid it flat on the table. "I wrote my wish here. We're a family, not because I was born into it, but because we chose each other." Ethan's eyes went red. He looked at Grace, then Zoe. No one spoke. There was only a quiet smile and a nod strong enough to make the silence tremble. Because sometimes, love doesn't need to be defined. It only needs to be lived and called by name. That afternoon, a soft breeze slipped through the cottage windows. The golden light of day's end stretched across the wooden floor, where Isabella sat piecing together pastel puzzle tiles into the shape of a heart. At the dining table, the 3 adults sat across from one another, a stack of documents between them, a pen, and a silence that said more than any words could. Grace was the first to speak, her voice as gentle as origami paper folding in slow hands. "I'm not here to take her back," she said, looking at Ethan. "I just want to do this right. And maybe doing it right means not doing it alone." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Her words echoed like footsteps in a room he once lived in, a room where he lost his child, lost his rights, and nearly lost himself. But now, a different door was opening. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. Grace slid the agreement toward him. "You won't be the primary guardian, but you'll always be there, not as a visitor, but as family, to care, to show up, to love, together." Zoe quietly placed her hand over Ethan's. The gentle squeeze said everything he couldn't find the words for. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." At that moment, Isabella looked up, as if she understood every unspoken thing. "So, I can sleep at Mommy's on weekends? Then come back here on Wednesdays to bake cookies with Daddy and Miss Zoe? The three adults laughed, a laugh that, for once, wasn't tangled with fear. Some things can't be split in two, but love, if it's big enough, can stretch in three directions and still remain whole. That morning, the sky over Oak Ridge was brushed with a soft mist. City Hall looked like any other government building: red brick, glass doors, a few pots of geraniums lining the steps. But to Ethan, it felt like a quiet monument standing between everything he'd lost and a miracle he never dared to dream. Isabella walked in wearing the yellow dress Zoe had tailored the night before, her hair braided gently by Grace, and the white shoes Ethan had picked. Not because they were pretty, but because they fit the steps of the new path she was taking. The judge was elderly, his voice gravelly, but his eyes kind. "Isabella Lane, do you understand what today means?" She nodded, then stepped forward, standing between the two people who now meant the world to her. "I choose to stay forever," she said, her voice steady. Ethan held her hand. Grace placed hers on her daughter's shoulder. In that moment, there was no past, no loss, only one thing: a family chosen with full hearts. The judge's seal landed with a soft thud, but in Ethan's chest, it echoed like the ringing of a new beginning. Outside, Zoe waited on the steps with a freshly baked apple pie and 3 cups of cocoa. Isabella ran to her, arms wide, pulling all three into a hug. "Now I have a real home," she whispered, beaming, "and a whole heart to keep it in." That night, the sky over Oak Ridge scattered stars like they'd been carved from broken dreams, now whole again. Behind the bakery, once a quiet place where Zoe used to sit alone through winter afternoons, had become the stage for a small gathering that felt impossibly warm. Zoe spread a checkered cloth across the grass, laying out warm pastries, homemade peach jam, chilled lemonade, and a tiny plate just for Bear, the loyal stuffed bear now donning a paper napkin apron, seated beside Isabella like an honored guest. Isabella beamed beneath a crown of dandelions she had woven herself. The delicate white petals resting on her curls made her look like a princess handpicked by life itself. Ethan stood beside Zoe, saying nothing, just watching Isabella twirl beneath the string lights, like every shadow from his past was slowly dissolving into light. "We're really a family now," Isabella announced, spinning between soft notes from the old radio Ethan had finally fixed the day before. Zoe turned to him, eyes glistening, smile unwavering. "She chose us," she whispered, "not because of blood, but because of heart." Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and she saved both of us. Behind them, 3 shadows, one tall, one mid-sized, one tiny, stretched long across the old brick wall, quiet proof etched in starlight. This is home. This is a beginning, and no one ever has to walk alone again. As the night drew to a close, everyone gathered around the small wooden table beneath the blooming bougainvillea, blossoming out of season, like everything else about this unexpected, beautiful evening. The warm string lights cast a golden glow across Isabella's eyes, sparkling, yet unusually deep. Ethan started to rise, meaning to say a few words, but just then, Isabella gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Can I say something?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it quieted the whole garden. She stepped into the center of the circle, still clutching Mr. Bear, her hair falling slightly across her brow. She took a deep breath and spoke, without being nudged or prompted. "I used to think home was a place with a porch, a bedroom, and a window looking out to a garden. But then I realized," she looked at Ethan, then at Zoe and Grace, "home isn't a room or a truck. It's where the hearts are." She paused, lifting a small hand to her chest, where her tiny heart beat strong. "And I have 3 hearts, one from Daddy Ethan, one from Mommy Grace, and one from Miss Zoe." Her voice trembled, but no tears fell. Zoe raised a hand to her mouth. Grace bowed her head. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, holding back the tide rising in his chest. In that moment, every wall, past, pain, boundaries, quietly dissolved. A new kind of family was born, one not built by blood, but by choice. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying Isabella's words into the night like a spell, gently planting them in the hearts of those who once believed they only had one lonely heart to live with. Ethan used to be a shadow, quiet, worn down, living out of a truck like a man waiting to disappear. He didn't believe he deserved anything good until a little girl appeared, carrying a teddy bear and a gaze that cracked his heart open, just enough for healing to begin. That morning in the small yard behind cottage number 3, once nothing more than dry grass and rotting crates, Ethan sat in a patch of soft sunlight, holding an old piece of oak. He carved each letter by hand. No ruler, no sketches. Just one thought in his mind. For the first time in my life, I'm making something worth keeping. From the kitchen door, Zoe watched, a streak of flour still smudged on her cheek. Isabella darted around the yard, wearing her slightly tattered dandelion crown like it was spun from gold. Ethan hammered the sign into place above the porch. The letters were rough, uneven, but clear. Our home. No longer a temporary truck. No longer a shelter from the rain. This was now a real home, filled with laughter, warm pastries, bedtime stories, and 3 people who shared no blood, but shared something stronger. The choice to stay. And sometimes a hand-carved wooden sign can say what 1,000 words never could. That you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You just have to not give up. In the back corner of the garden behind cottage number 3, Ethan's old truck now rested quietly beneath the blooming bougainvillea. No more sunken wheels in the mud, no more rust-bitten cold, just a fresh coat of soft gray paint, a pine wood roof added by hand, a small bookshelf inside, and a rocking chair on a rug. Zoe called it the magic room. As for Isabella, the little girl who once curled beneath that roof in the middle of a stormy night, she'd turned it into a sacred space, a place for writing in her journal, telling stories to Mr. Bear, and sometimes just sitting to remember. Every time Ethan passed by, he paused for a moment, not from sadness, but from something sacred, something unnameable. That truck had once been his last shelter when he'd lost everything. And then, it became the first place he was called Daddy again. One autumn afternoon, the 3 of them sat together inside. Isabella opened her little notebook and pointed to the first page, a drawing of a house with 3 hearts, one blue, one yellow, one red, and a truck with angel wings. "This," she whispered, "is where I started dreaming again." They didn't need a mansion. They didn't need matching birth certificates. They just needed to keep the truck, not for traveling, but as a reminder. Sometimes the oldest, most worn-out things hold the door to the most beautiful miracles. That journey didn't end with the truck, and it didn't close with the sign that read "Our Home" hanging over the cottage porch. Because inside the hearts of Ethan, Isabella, Zoe, and even Grace, a new chapter had only just begun. By the following spring, they moved the old truck to the center of the town park, where it now stood with quiet pride as a free reading nook for children. Etched into its side were the words, "Where the miracle began and where love never ends." And Isabella, at the town's first summer festival, stood before a crowd of hundreds and told her story. No script, no prompting, just her heart speaking for itself. "Home isn't where you're born," she said, her voice trembling slightly but her eyes shining. "Home is where you're accepted, where you're loved, and where you get to call someone family, even if you don't share the same last name." The square fell silent and then erupted into applause. Ethan pulled Zoe and Grace into a tight embrace, 2 women who had helped him rebuild a world he thought he'd lost forever. Because the story of Isabella, Ethan, and Zoe wasn't just about adoption. It was proof, living, breathing proof, that sometimes miracles arrive dressed as heartbreak, and it's love, no matter how late it arrives, that makes life worth living. If you've ever felt like you've lost too much to start again, remember that old truck. And if you believe someone out there still deserves a second chance, drop a comment below and share what's in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, because the next miracle might just be yours. The story of Ethan, Isabella, and Zoe isn't just a tale of adoption. It's a miracle born from broken souls finding each other in a vast, chaotic world. It reminds us that family isn't always written in blood. Sometimes it's written in choice, in trust, and in a love that asks for nothing in return. Ethan was once a lonely man living in a truck, carrying scars from a past he couldn't outrun, and the weight of all he thought he'd failed to protect. Isabella was a nameless child with no memories, only a tattered teddy bear for company. And Zoe, a woman who had known loss, opened her heart to two strangers, only to discover she was healing right alongside them. We don't get to choose where we're born, but we do get to choose how we love. And sometimes salvation doesn't come wrapped in something grand. It begins with the smallest gesture, a warm pastry, a handmade curtain, a child whispering, "Daddy," for the very first time. Life has a way of turning corners when we least expect it. But if we're brave enough to open our hearts, patient enough to listen, maybe, just maybe, we become someone's miracle. Just like Ethan became Isabella's. And maybe that's the most beautiful meaning of truly living, not just to survive, but to love and to be needed.